An area that I absolutely love to learn more about is the overlap between physical health and mental health. When we really get focused on one kind of instead of the other, we can forget or we can just never learn about the other, which is really a disservice to ourselves because there is an important connection there. And I recently had the opportunity to connect with today's guest, Dr. Robert Dahl, about the importance of physical health on our mental health. And I'm excited to introduce him to you today so we can all learn more together. But to give you a little more background first, he initially followed family tradition after high school and became a fourth generation U.S. Army soldier, serving as a combat medic for 4 years. After military service, he worked in IT and attended Texas Christian University as a religion major, while also serving as the praise and worship leader at his local church. He was inspired then to return to medicine, so he transferred to the University of North Texas, where he graduated summa cum laude with a degree in biology and psychology. Subsequently, he completed his MD at the University of Texas Medical Branch, John Seeley School of Medicine, and he currently works as a psychiatrist for the UT Tyler School of Medicine. Outside of work, he enjoys spending time with his wife, Sarah, and their family. So, jumping right into this, I am so excited for this conversation. I want us to have as much time as possible. So I'm going to give you the first question right out of the gate. How significant have you found physical health to be in connection with mental health, excuse me?
It's almost kind of really a two-pronged question because, I deal with some patients that are, very profoundly sick, that are institutionalized, that will be institutionalized for the rest of their life. And so for those patients, there's kind of one answer to that question. And then really kind of when I think about the general public, there's maybe a little different side of it. So, and I think probably the listeners are more interested in kind of the broader aspect of it. And so I'll answer from that aspect with the caveat that if there are other, healthcare professionals listening, I'm not leaving out, kind of the hospitalized patient side of things. I just think that maybe is less relevant to our conversation today. So, one of the things that I'm a big advocate about is that there's just a big swath of research that really looks at inflammatory process and how that impacts mental health. With the overarching view that kind of more inflammation, more brain inflammation specifically is really kind of detrimental to these neurocognitive processes that go on and that we often attribute to, when we think about mental well-being. As a good example, I'm a veteran, and so I follow a lot of the research that kind of happens with the VA, and it wasn't that long ago, in concert with Texas A&M, the VA replicated the post-mortem brain findings that are kind of indicative of Gulf War veterans that have been diagnosed with Gulf War illness or Gulf War disease now, by conducting animal studies with rats where they had essentially fed these rats the same, their PBR tablets, their physogostigmine bromide tablets that were handed out kind of like candy as anti-nerve agents during the Gulf War. And basically, I would say, a vast majority of these vets suffer from behavioral kind of dysregulation. And at the end of the day, the finding is that the consistency between the rat brains and the human brains was that this profound inflammation that had been caused by, in a controlled environment by simply the application of this single substance. So it's important enough to know that, a single thing that's throwing you off, and, you don't have to be a Gulf War veteran for this. You can just be someone who has a profound, food reaction to pickles or bananas or whatever it is, the flavor of the day. So from that broad perspective, I think that probably the most important thing I think about in physical health, connection with mental health, is kind of, what is the inflammatory state of the person that we're talking about. And, if they're predisposed to it, even if they're entirely healthy, I think there's always room for optimization there. But it's one of the things I ask patients when a patient comes in and there's not something really obvious, because oftentimes, life circumstances are what are driving patients' complaints. But when there's not, first thing and we'll talk about some of these other things later, but really I look at nutrition, we look at sleep, and we look at exercise. And those three things in general are kind of the three legs that the stool of, that we sit on for our well-being kind of are held up by.
Wow. So we are going to get into each of those three separately, but before we jump into it, am I understanding correctly that all three of those areas can contribute to the inflammation that then also somehow, if you could connect this dot for me, somehow affects our mental health?
Sure. Right. And in general, we think about, the way we think, the way we perceive the world, right, is done through, connections, through neurons, right? And those are both chemical and electrical signals. And things that disrupt those signals, anything, whether that be mechanical or, I think of like demyelinating diseases like multiple sclerosis and stuff. Those are other, kind of pathways. And then we have things like electrolyte imbalances, right? So when someone has acute altered mental status secondary to, what we call, metabolic encephalopathy because they are super dehydrated. So all of those things, right, when those neurons can't communicate correctly, the end result is, an alteration in your, ability to think and function normally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Gosh. And yet it's not typically considered when people, not typically, at least in the audience that I serve. I don't think I've ever heard people come to us saying, yeah, so, I've been struggling in these different ways and I've addressed things like diet. So I have one person, and this person's going to know that I'm referencing them right now. They're probably going to laugh. But I have one person who's very into this conversation, is going to love this episode, and has absolutely found a difference. And so I'm excited to share more of this information with everyone who's listening, everyone who's watching, because there may be some changes that you can make and you start to see a difference. It's like, wow. That I would say easier in ways, maybe harder in others, because no sugar is harder for me than some other things I've done. Sure. And yet I recognize the importance, and I absolutely recognize the difference of if I am consuming versus if I'm really trying not to. So with that being said, before I want to bring in one other aspect here before I promise everyone we're going to get into kind of sleep, diet, and exercise. But I want to bring in this one other piece first, because if I remember this correctly, Rob, I know that you have the religious training background, I believe with your undergraduate degree. I think you told me that you're also ordained. Do I have that correct? And you did serve correct. In that area for a while directly. Yeah,
correct. Yes.
Okay.
My intent when I went to TCU was to enter seminary. So I was a religion major. I was working in the position of a praise and worship pastor, and then moved up to associate pastor position at a church. And, it really was, kind of just to unpack a little bit of that background was, kind of got to see the inner machinations that I think probably a lot of your audience is very familiar with, that, once you peel the sheen off of the surface of what's going on, and you kind of see the background, and I really, I came to this kind of crisis and crossroads where I really felt called to serve, and I for me, a life of service is really kind of the only life I've ever seen. It's just been in different areas. But what I realized was that for me, and part of my mental health is so important to not feel like I was being pressured into believing or adopting beliefs or practices that didn't sit well in my own heart. And I didn't want my paycheck to depend on that. So I didn't want to be in a position where my mortgage payment or my car payment depended on me saying or behaving in a way that I felt was not consistent with the way that God wanted me to be. They just weren't consistent with this, this bridge that, for me as a Christian, that I feel Christ came to be this bridge so that we didn't need a priest to intercede with us. So we've got this close connection, and I just didn't feel like violating that was worth a paycheck. And so that was really when the question came up of, gosh, I really still feel called to serve people. And I take, profound joy in helping someone overcome, a struggle in their life. And I thought, where else am I going to get that if I'm not going to do this for a living? And I think that was really kind of when the idea of medicine came up as well. Hey, this is something else you've done in the past. You really enjoyed it. And, there's definitely lots of people that need help. So
it's such a neat journey you've been on. And it leads me to this question, kind of this merging of these two aspects. I'm wondering, between this physical health component and the mental health component, bringing the theological aspect as well from your training, do you see any sort of connection theologically with this?
Well, I think that, Scripture's full of kind of this overarching theme of, just both physical and mental kind of infirmities. If we're going to, kind of use that term, everything from, if we look from, early on, we look at Job, certainly, we look at the idea of, the thorn in the flesh for Paul, and there's various theological, ideas about what that might have actually been. But I think that there's a lot of folks that believe that really was, an ailment, a health ailment. And, what's the purpose of those things, right? What are the purpose of that in our well-being? And Paul makes a very good connection, and he's basically like, it's kind of to keep me in check. And, so how does that play into it? Well, I would say that, being aware of kind of our own limitations and our own mortality is something that is scary, but also I think is something that draws us closer to God. It pulls us in and forces us to not lean on ourselves, and to really kind of, do the things that I think we were made to do, which is to, lean into God and through, strong friendships and relationships, lean into others, that are again, trusted others. I want to, again, make that caveat, not to just randomly, lean on or lean into others, but, folks that are, well vetted in your circle, your family and your good friends, and people that are trusted. We're built to work with one another, and we're built to lean into God. At least that's the way I kind of see how our optimum health functions. And as a kind of a common clinical example I see is I oftentimes see patients that are, profoundly ill from a medicological aspect, meaning that, they have multiple, comorbid conditions, and many of them are chronic. Sometimes they're even terminal. But these patients haven't lost their sense of joy. And invariably, when I always say, you're doing really well considering, and the answer is always, well, I go with grace, I go with God, do justly, walk humbly with your God. So it's just kind of a common recurrent theme, that I see. And I've done medicine everywhere from, big city at, Parkland, at UT Southwestern in Dallas, to working in Houston in the Texas Medical Center, to being kind of in a smaller rural community here in East Texas. And that reigns true. Maybe it's still all Texas, but, certainly, Houston and Dallas are not, labyrinths of conservatism. So, finding that kind of consistent, mechanism of what allows people to keep their joy is really their connection with God, even in the face of just profound, physical and even, psychological, behavioral disability, right up to kind of, I can't not mention the fact that our pastor's wife, which was a big part of what kind of made me pick my specialty in medicine, she had Huntington's, and just an amazing lady, amazing family. And if you were ever to kind of have this theodicy conversation of why this person, God, of all the people who you would inflict, why Cindy, and Huntington's is an awful disease that ends up causing just kind of profound behavioral deficits that make a person behave in a way that you would never ever have expected them to, and it's beyond their control, right? I mean, the the way the brain deteriorates makes it thus so that this beloved person is behaving very erratically, much as the way we see happens with major neurocognitive disorders like frontotemporal dementia or Alzheimer's. But again, there's this kind of the thing that makes those events kind of palatable, if you will, because I don't think it's hard to find joy in those events, but nonetheless, I do see people, still do it. And the only thing that I've ever seen that allows people to kind of have joy through those scenarios is their connection with God.
Yeah, I think that was well said. There is not, for people who don't have faith, I don't know what else there would be. And so sort of that idea of like kind of coming to the end of ourselves in what can be a really tragic way, but also in a redemptive way, in the beauty that God brings through it. And also, gosh, I've said this to myself a few times, just at really tough points in my own processing and my own journey with pains from family and things like that. And I truly have found reassurance in I don't have to do this forever. Someday I will not be living this life in this way. And I'm grateful for the life I have now. And yet I'm also grateful that it isn't eternity like this, that it's going to look different at some point in the future. So I think moving ahead, I want to get into, again, rest, diet, exercise. And I'm thinking about all of the people that we meet here at Be Emboldened. They have experienced some form of spiritual abuse. So, I mean, that can look like different things. It can look like on the mission field. It can look like in a church, in a parachurch organization. It can look like something going on within the home. And so whether they would meet some sort of criteria for a clinical diagnosis or not for mental health, there are different considerations I know that they can take a look at as they are healing and processing and looking to rebuild their lives that might be able to support them well when they're having those kind of post-trauma experiences. I'm not saying PTSD, but just okay, I've experienced a trauma and I'm having various struggles, and maybe it constitutes a diagnosis or it doesn't, but what can I do to sort of support myself well, kind of come alongside me as I'm journeying through these really tough conversations. People are processing and making sense of things, just all kinds of things come back up, even if it's been a decade, since the experience. And so all of a sudden their sleep's disturbed and maybe they're wanting to binge eat, or they're not wanting to really eat anything, or they're wanting to eat certain kinds of foods, and exercise very commonly goes out the window. And so I want to give people some really practical ideas of things that they can take a look at in their own lives that may help them see a difference, again, in this mental health area. So with that being said, Rob, do you mind if we start with rest?
Sure. Rest is, it's important, so much so that, I have to tell this to my kids sometimes when they won't go to bed. They say, I'm not going to go to sleep. I tell them, well, this is going to be bad if you don't sleep, because, sleep is important enough that you can die if you don't sleep long enough. And, again, coming from, I'm a Gulf War vet myself, and I will tell you that sleep deprivation is a very kind of common form of, torture. So it's, it's critical. And, if without getting bogged down in the neuroscience of it, because the neuroscience is really interesting for me, but probably not for everybody. But without kind of getting too deep into it, is that I tend to think of it this way, right? So our brain is this big metabolic organ. And when I say metabolic, I mean there's processes that have to go on. We talked about these chemical signals, okay? Those are proteins that are moving around in your brain. We talked about these electrical signals. Nothing happens for free, right? So we have to generate energy. We have to create new proteins to make this happen. The process of doing that is, done in a cellular factory, and much like a physical factory, here in Tyler, Texas, we have the refineries. Much in the process of a regular factory, there is kind of a waste product. There is stuff that is, it's smoke, it's whatever, from making the product. The same thing happens, in our cells as they make proteins, as they generate electrical gradients in order to move signals, down, axons. That process generates waste product. We call it, metabolic waste products, right? And sleep is the remedy to clear those products. Okay, at a fundamental level, I think that's the biggest thing. And so sleep is important for, getting rid of those toxins in the brain that build up because the brain is doing its job. It's processing, and it's helping you stay smart and stay alert and stay alive. But it needs time, right? It needs time for the cleaning crew to come in and kind of wash things out. There's the other kind of, flip side of it is, when we talk about, neuronal growth and kind of making synaptic connections, there's a gentleman, used to be, I think he has retired since, but his name is John Pelly. He's a PhD, used to teach at Texas Tech School of Medicine. And he does a really good TED Talk if people are interested. And he talks about, this idea of that, demonstrated that you really can't make these new neuronal connections, these synaptic connections that are how we create our long-term memories without sleep. And the reason that was interesting to Dr. Pelly was because, his kind of focus was on, graduate medical education. And so, when you're kind of operating at these high ranks of graduate level education, it's kind of, you're really looking for next level. How can we process these vast amounts of information and retain it so that it's useful and so that we can recall it? And one of the ways we do that is by making these synaptic connections. And it's just substantially more difficult, if not entirely impossible, to do that without sleeping, right? And even, again, in my practice, I see that, we see a lot of EEGs whenever we're looking at patients that perhaps have comorbid neurological problems. So that's an electroencephalogram, and it looks at kind of the brain waves, and the waves on those readings change when you're asleep versus when you're awake versus when you're having a seizure, so the brain is doing something different, right? And again, without getting bogged down in all of the the neuroscience and the cellular chemistry, I just think it's kind of it's settled science that we know sleep is important for the metabolic functions of the brain to do what they need to do, and that is important for memory. It's important for behavioral cognition, and I know you kind of brought this up in maybe something we'll touch on later, but this kind of neurogenesis, right, where we're kind of growing new synapses or even growing new neurons in places like the hippocampus, which are for memory consolidation, but also really for this kind of emotional regulation. And emotions are a good thing, right? I think it's a God-given thing, but they sometimes can be overwhelming, and when they're dysregulated, they certainly can have a very significant impact on our well-being. So kind of allowing that neurogenesis to happen in the hippocampus is another thing that sleep is again a big part of the triad that helps make that happen.
So when we get the sleep, our brain is then able to, like you said, it's doing something different, which includes ridding the toxins. If the toxins are not gotten rid of, what kind of effects do we see in the mental health area? So give an idea of what people maybe could pick up on if they're like, oh yeah, I know I haven't been sleeping well, and maybe me feeling X is related to that.
Right. So, probably the clearest cut clinical example I can give you is that, happens in the case of bipolar disorder, right? So there's a couple different flavors of bipolar disorder. And, we're talking about this earlier about, clinical diagnosis. I always, again, throw this caveat out there. There's no lab test for a lot of this stuff. So I can't draw your blood and say, oh, you have PTSD or you have bipolar disorder, right? They're man-made constructs, right? And, we're working on this thing. We call this the DSM. This is the book that we as psychiatrists use. But really it's more of it's a convenience way for us to kind of group clinical symptoms together and stuff. So, for those people out there who may have received a diagnosis of, well, I was diagnosed with depression, or I was diagnosed with adjustment disorder or PTSD, that the caveat is that is a group of symptoms, and a lot of times, again, the caveat is that I undiagnose stuff a lot of times, so it's not. Oh, well, this doctor said I had this because he has a blood test that proves that I had this. Well, yes, you can have hepatitis C, you've still got that, right? But you might have been diagnosed by one doctor with bipolar disorder, and another doctor says, really, I don't really know. I don't see that, right? I see something different. So anyway, on the subject of bipolar disorder, one of the things that, bipolar disorder often is a high functioning disorder. So folks that are kind of what we call hypomanic, they often will actually be more higher functioning than their peers. And so it's not uncommon to see someone who is the CEO of a corporation or a well-known actor, actress, or musician that they have bipolar disorder. And so you're like, wow, they're really productive. How are they doing this? Where it becomes a problem is when they get into this kind of full-blown mania, which means usually not sleeping for more than 3 or 4 days in a row. And what happens is when they get to this point where they're not sleeping for multiple days in a row, they start to become psychotic. And psychosis is really kind of, defined by auditory and visual hallucinations and, kind of delusional thinking, disorganized behavior. So, when I say psychosis, I talk about, somebody who is like trying to sleep in the refrigerator and they're, seeing, butterflies on their toes. And, oftentimes they're, if it's a paranoid delusion, they're kind of very paranoid that people are coming after them. And one of the ways that I differentiate when someone comes in and they're brought in, I do, a lot of times I'm on the psychiatric emergency services rotation. And if I have someone who comes in and they're acutely psychotic, it's really kind of almost impossible without corroborating evidence, whether this is a substance-induced psychosis, whether this is a true, first-break schizophrenia, or whether this is, bipolar mania that is now devolved into psychosis. And the one easiest way to differentiate that is we put those patients to sleep. And when I say we put them to sleep, we usually give them medication that will, help them kind of go to sleep. And when they wake up, if the psychosis is gone, then I'm like, that was bipolar, that was mania that was driving that, right? If they wake up and, the psychosis is not gone, then I go, okay, so it probably wasn't mania driving that because they're still psychotic even though they've slept. But it's a really kind of easy litmus test for me to kind of put somebody over in one bucket or the other, right? Is, okay, the first doctor I ever worked with, he kind of ingrained it in me. He says, what's the first thing you want to do when someone comes in, you suspect that they're manic from bipolar disorder? And, he just kind of put his head in his hands and said, put them to sleep. We put them to sleep. And, 9 times out of 10, if that person has bipolar mania and we put them to sleep, they wake up and the psychosis is gone. And oftentimes the mania is gone as well. So, the effects are very well known. And so you can, I have another colleague that says, any brain can become psychotic if deprived of sleep long enough. And I oftentimes work 24-hour shifts. It's not uncommon for me to start, feeling a little paranoid and going, what, did I just hear something? There's a really good book by Oliver Sacks called Hallucinations that kind of talks about, the history of hallucinations and how, it's pretty normal for people to actually have them when you're sleep deprived, right? It's one of the easiest ways we know to induce them. So yes, the brain devolves into psychosis, at some level of lack of sleep, and it doesn't have to be really that long.
Right. When you're talking a few days and that happens, it really speaks to how important sleep is. And I know personally, gosh, even just from, having a child for all of us who have had very disrupted sleep, maybe, which I want to chat about circadian rhythm here too in a moment, but just those disruptions as well that we can have. I'm just not able to regulate emotions in the same way. I like to be a pretty steady person, feeling things, but being able to not get too erratic, and kind of be on a roller coaster. And so, but that ability gets really tough if I don't have enough sleep. And personally, I'm way more apt to just want to cry easier, feel hopelessness, things like that. And so a sense of not clinical depression, but that sort of depressed feeling of feeling really down. And absolutely, and I'll recognize, I know that I do not do well with sacrificing sleep. My husband can get away with this 6 hours for a few days. I don't do well. I notice it pretty quickly. And so I appreciate you two speaking to how we can have some differences from person to person, but I'll recognize, I just need a really good night's sleep. And after one or two of those, I feel normal again. So I'm wondering, how about some of those emotional impacts or that ability to emotionally regulate in connection with sleep deprivation?
Right. So, I tend to, I even see it in a broader picture, right? So, yeah, I was just talking with one of my colleagues who she just came off of 2 months of what we call night float, where you work 7 to 7 overnights. And we were talking about not just the kind of the dysregulation that comes as far as emotion and thought processes, but how the fact that whenever we do this, it's like, why is it so hard to stick to my diet when I'm working overnight, right? And really there is. So I tend to think of it as willpower. There's really this kind of dysregulation in willpower. And so, particularly people who are struggling with, something that may be, approaching addiction or, just an unhealthy relationship with food or with tobacco or with alcohol, those things are all made worse when we become sleep deprived. It's kind of like I just would in general say, our willpower, you kind of have a finite amount of willpower in any given day. And that amount seems to be kind of automatically depleted when our sleep is disturbed, or, when it's absent altogether. My biggest advice in that is to not allow it to spiral, meaning catch up when you can. Okay. And the other thing is, and again, something I tell patients over and over again is, be kind to yourself. Like, give yourself some latitude. And that doesn't mean give yourself latitude to indulge in things, but don't continue to beat yourself up. And that is something that, again, I think, specifically looking at folks who have kind of come from an environment where, again, they've had, maybe some kind of abusive experiences. We talk about this default mode network, which is kind of where we go when we're not being stimulated. So the default mode network is kind of when I'm not engaged in something, where does my mind go? Right. And it often goes to, I'm going to beat myself up because, I had to work overnights last night, and man, at 3:00 in the morning, I just went down to the vending machines and had a Red Baron pizza or whatever, and that blew my carbs out the window or whatever. And then we just ruminate on that, and you continue. That kind of becomes the soup du jour, and that leads to this kind of recurrent negative thinking. And it's interesting because what we've seen with kind of looking at how is it that we disengage from this default mode network. And it's a lot of the things that are really bad for us. So smoking is a classic example. So one of the things that will kind of disengage your default mode network is smoking. So oftentimes folks who already, have a tobacco use disorder, when they're starting to beat themselves up, that's the time that they decide to light up or have a new, dip of snuff, because it literally pulls them out of their own head. Another really kind of fascinating thing that is really impactful on youth is video games. One of the ways we found you can disengage the default mode network is through video gaming, right? So, I'm not saying that video games are bad, right? Because they risk, Dr. Dahl said that video games are bad. This guy has a total bunk science. No, look, I play video games. I think, lots of things in moderation can have, beneficial impact on your life. But what we see, especially with a lot of youth in this current age of, social media is on 24/7. There's never a break from the glaring eye of the camera. There's never a break from, oh my gosh, look what Johnny or Susie is doing today. Their parents are so much better than mine. They're such a better athlete than me. The way kids tend to shut that default mode network off is through gaming. And I don't think that's a healthy response.
Yeah, and I'm fine with you saying video games are bad. I know you're not. But I'm trying to avoid my son wanting to get too into video games. It's definitely, there's definitely an allure there. So I'm thinking about the effects too. I think you've kind of broached that topic a bit, maybe stepped into it a little bit here when you're talking about working overnight. So the idea of circadian rhythm and how it's not necessarily maybe only about having enough hours, but there can be something to when those hours are. So do you mind educating a little bit on what that looks like? Again, in that practical way of those who are tuning in, who are struggling, what could they maybe do as well that would be helpful?
If you, so kind of the big thing is, at a basic level is light, right? If I have to sum it all up, light is kind of the foundation of good sleep hygiene. And so what do I mean by light, right? So, the biggest kind of thing that goes on with our sleep regulation, the circadian rhythm, happens with melatonin. And melatonin is kind of regulated by this thing we call the supraoptic nucleus in our brain. And essentially we are hardwired for that to be kind of driven by light. Okay. So, when the sun comes up, your brain kind of shuts down and says, okay, it's time to stop making all this melatonin. It's time to wake up, time to go, gather food, go to work, do whatever it is you got to do during the day. When the lights are out, brain says, okay, it must be time to go to sleep because, I always say this, we are our brains, but your brain has never actually seen the outside world. It's never been outside. It lives in your head, and it has to kind of rely on eyes and ears and everything else to kind of tell it what's actually going on. So if you are sending it a false signal because you're sleeping with the TV on all night, or because you're sleeping with the lights on, or because you've got this, beautiful alarm clock with big, bright blue LED light or LED numbers, next to your bed, what that is doing is it is sending these signals, even through your eyelids, to your supraoptic nucleus saying, hey, sun's up, sun's out, it's time to stop making melatonin. And then you go, what? I'm waking up 3, 4, 5, 6 times a night, and so sleep hygiene, the foundation of sleep hygiene, I always tell folks, is 2 big things, is that, you should be sleeping in the dark. Okay. So your room should be dark. Again, with the caveat that you should have access to light. If you need to get up, right? If you're somebody who needs to get up in the middle of the night to use the restroom, if you need to get up and check on a little one or something, sure, have access to light. I always make the suggestion of having a red light. So you can buy, I'm a little bit of an astronomy nerd, so you can buy an astronomer's light, which is just, it's red light, right? Which won't disrupt that kind of, that pathway in your brain that you can use to kind of get around at night. There's lots of, non-blue lights, right? So there'll be night lights that don't have any blue wavelength. Those are kind of the most disturbing wavelengths, is the blue ones. Part of that is also staying off screens, least a couple hours before bed. That is a hard one to break. And I'll be honest, the world is full of hypocrites, and I'm the king, because staying off of screens 2 hours before bedtime is it's almost impossible, especially if in this connected world, and especially, if you're somebody who multiple people are relying on. If you've got kids, if you've got a significant other, if you've got friends who are like, hey, man, I know it's 9:30 and you're going to bed, but right, to not look at your phone for 2 hours is tough. Okay. So, don't get me wrong. Those are ideals. Those are what we should strive for. And if you know that you've had a bad run, right, if you like, okay, look, I can't do this every night, but I've had bad sleep for 2 nights in a row. Tonight, I'm going to put my phone in a lockbox and I'm going to stay off screens for 2 nights because I need to get a good night's sleep. So again, be kind to yourself, make those compromises. It doesn't have to be this kind of rigid, like, oh, I can never do this again, because those are almost impossible to stick to. And then people get discouraged and they don't want to do it. So, sleep hygiene, super important. And along with that sleep hygiene, right, and these circadian rhythms, one of the things that, again, I say this for the, kind of aging population is a lot of times one of the other things that will wake you up is if you're being disturbed in the night. Now, if you've got a kiddo, I can't help you for that. There's no pill that I can give you to make your kid stop crying in the middle of the night. Not really any safe pills I can give your kids to make that stop crying. But if you're somebody who gets up to go to the restroom a bunch of times in the middle of the night, now that may be an actual underlying medical condition. And that's something worth having a conversation with your physician about, because oftentimes when I have patients that have depression, I find that kind of one of the big drivers of that depression is impaired sleep. And it turns out that the impaired sleep is something that is relatively straightforward to fix from an organic standpoint. So it may be someone who has what we call benign prostate hyperplasia, BPH. And that, for men, as we age, it makes it so that you can't empty your bladder as often or as completely as you need to. And so you end up kind of getting up 2-3 times in the night to go to the restroom. There are medications and therapies and even surgeries that can fix that problem, that allow you to get up less frequently. And that equals less sleep disturbance, and that oftentimes drastically improves behavioral health. Another very common thing that I see happen is folks that have sleep apnea, right? So they have sleep apnea from everything from, just enlarged tonsils to maybe having a little too much weight to sometimes it's just a central sleep apnea that's, secondary to other conditions. And those folks, when we get them in, we get a sleep study. The big $5 word is polysomnography. We find out that they need a CPAP or a BiPAP or some iteration of a sleep breathing machine. They get on sleep breathing treatments. They sleep like a baby through the night, and all of a sudden their mood is, drastically improved. And sometimes those folks say that, they don't need to even be on medication for depression anymore, because what was really driving their depression was the fact that they were waking up every 25 minutes throughout the night and disturbing their circadian rhythms. We fix that problem, and we fix the behavioral problem.
Wow. Yeah, it's so impactful. Now, the last question I have about sleep, and then we will have to pick this up in a part 2 because I know we're wrapping up on our time for today. But my last question about sleep in connection with circadian rhythm, how important is it to have consistency and, say, time of going to sleep, time of awakening? Is that also important, or is that more flexible?
I mean, if you know how much sleep you need, and most people have a reasonable idea of how much sleep they need. And again, the caveat is that can change over our lifespan. But if you know how much sleep you need, then getting that consistently absolutely, helps the process. I would say it's maybe not as impactful as some of the other things that we've talked about thus far, because, so for example, a big glaring TV in the room is just going to wreck your sleep all night long because it's constantly bombarding you. If you're going to bed an hour later, an hour earlier every other night, that I think the kind of the impact on your circadian rhythm is shorter lived, because the insult that's occurring is shorter lived. But it's important enough that, there are apps for it, even, as a default, if you're an iOS user, Apple kind of has even a default, like a bedtime kind of set up on their, as part of their default operating system that will help you kind of get this really consistent right down to this very finite level of within a minute or two, of you should wake up exactly this many minutes. Again, I think there's always room for optimization. If I could only pick one thing, I would pick light. And if I had to go with number two, I would say it would be those folks who are having perturbations in numerous times the night, which most often is sleep apnea. But if you've already tuned up those two things, right? And the other thing, I got to throw this in because I forgot about this earlier, is also really you're only using your bed for a couple things. Sleep is one of them. The other thing I'll leave to the listener's imagination. But really, when we start doing other things when we start playing video games in our bed, you're playing board games in the bed, we have these things we call set and setting in psychology. And what you're doing is you're preparing your mind for this idea that, hey, might be time to play Monopoly, right? If I'm sitting in the bed, or it might be time to play Angry Birds, right? So limiting the activities that we do in the bed. But again, as back to this, wake up, go to sleep time. Yes. Ideally, yes. And so how important is it? There was a study that came out, and I really love emergency medicine. I was a combat medic in the Army, and I do love the thrill of the emergency room. I still, do spend time on psych emergency services. So I still work in the emergency room, but more in psychiatric emergency context. But there's times when, depending on how busy the ED is, I will sew up a finger or, do a bedside incision and drainage for somebody. So I really like it. But one of the things, probably the most important thing that convinced me to stay out of emergency medicine was a very trusted mentor I have, who was an emergency medicine physician, who got out of emergency medicine and really kind of more into medical toxicology, because the impact of shift work is so deleterious that there was a study that came out that showed that this kind of shift work, in the sense of changing shifts, so working day shift, then working night shift, then working second shift, has about the equivalent impact of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day on your health. So if you can imagine, if you're a physician and you're trying to stay healthy, and you're like, well, I don't smoke and I don't drink and I exercise regularly and I'm doing all these things for my health, thinking that your choice of employment, and there may be some emergency physicians in the audience that will hate on me for this, but your choice of employment can really kind of drastically, impact your health. Again, I know not everybody's in a position where they can say, well, Dr. Dahl, I wish I could work, just all 9 to 5s, but I can't. I'm there with you. I wish I could work all 9 to 5s as well, and I don't. A week from now, I will be working 24 hours on Saturday. So, but again, there's this idea of, be kind to yourself. If you have had this kind of insult to your sleep schedule, then be kind to yourself and make up for that when you can. And so, yes, going to sleep same time every night is, again, depending on how large that insult is and how often it's being switched, can be very deleterious. Up to, and again, I think of one of the worst things you could do for your health is smoke cigarettes. On any given day, our intermediate care unit at the hospital is full of patients that are almost entirely collapsing from smoking complications. It boggles my mind that in 2024, that of all the things that are illegal, smoking is not. And again, it's not to hate on anybody who is smoking. It is a very serious addiction. It is absolutely as addicting as any of the hard drugs. And I treat, again, a lot of folks that have very serious hard drug addictions. And I have patients that will kick their addiction to methamphetamine, that will kick an addiction to heroin, and they can't kick cigarettes. So it's not a slight to anyone who's smoking. It's just saying that, man, it is a real challenge. And I encourage you to continue to fight that good fight if that's what you're trying to do. And just, realize that your healthcare professionals are here to support you in that, in any way, shape, or form we can.
Well said. Gosh, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking of the different ways that this intersects with my life. Like, oh, I sit in bed at night and I clear out my email inbox. Okay, probably shouldn't do that anymore. And the reason I actually do it, Rob, is because it's a more relaxing environment to do it in. So I feel less like I'm working, but it is harder than to actually totally shut off and go to sleep. So different ways that kind of rubber meets the road. Another thing I want to touch on really quickly. Well, two things as we're wrapping up here for part one is absolutely, you had said earlier about how people have come out of, I would say, high control environments and just that default mode that they can have of ways that they're not measuring up, ways that they've quote unquote failed. And I like sharing with people that it's one thing to distract as a coping mechanism to the degree that we don't actually address anything that's really going on a deeper level, but it's another thing to allow ourselves breaks and seeing how we're using things like video games or whatever it may be. How are we using that? Are we using it in a way that is not deterring the overall goal we're trying to reach? Rather, it's giving us a break that maybe actually helps us reach the overall goal that we're trying to reach. And so different ways to think about it. And then lastly, in regards to just that getting the sleep and kind of prioritizing, I want to land us there. And I really appreciate your perspective. We're not going to be able to do all of this perfectly. And so here's sort of priorities that we can take a look at the best that we're able. And we are doing that. We're doing the best that we can. So I hope that this part one of our conversation gives people some things to think about. I hope you all have some things that you can think about, maybe some changes that you can consider making, as kind of micro as they may be, and take note of, are you noticing a difference? Again, I know that I very, very practically, very tangibly, being a tangible human being here, can tell the difference in how I am functioning with some of these changes. And then when I don't, that willpower thing is huge. If I don't have enough sleep, my willpower goes out the window. Absolutely, that's when I'm eating the cupcakes. And not that eating a cupcake's bad, but if you're going to live off cupcakes for a couple of days, that's probably not ideal. And so keeping those things kind of in check and recognizing, all right, what's going on and how is this maybe impacting how I'm doing overall? And if I am not getting enough sleep for a few days because I'm working a 24-hour overnight, I'm probably not going to meet with, someone like me the very next day. I'm probably going to prioritize sleep because I'm just not going to have the bandwidth. I'm not going to have the capacity. So kind of taking those things into account. So again, Dr. Dahl, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for part two. So please, everyone come back, tune in. We're going to get into diet. We're going to get into exercise, and then we will wrap up this conversation. I hope that you guys are as blessed by it as I am. So thank you so much again for being here.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.